Berlin, March 1943. In a dimly lit office, the air thick with smoke curling from a dozen unseen corners of the Oberkommando, a man whose conscience few dared to name aloud was quietly assembling a report that could tilt the balance of a continent. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, had spent decades watching Europe through the prism of secrecy and observation. He had seen armies rise and fall, tyrants ascend and crumble, yet nothing he held in his hands that night compared to the magnitude of the revelation before him. The report spoke of a single American factory, whispered to possess the astonishing capability to produce a four-engine bomber every hour, a figure so audacious it might have sounded like Allied propaganda. Yet the numbers were consistent, the sources credible. It bore the name Willow Run, and if the projections were accurate, the consequences were nothing short of catastrophic. Canaris traced his fingers along the columns of projected output, labor force, engine production, fuel consumption, the cadence of assembly. It was not a dream. It was arithmetic. The dawn of a new kind of war was rising, one where victory would hinge less on tanks or guns and more on factories and conveyor belts. He understood instantly that this was a front Germany could not ignore. When Canaris presented his findings to his aides, silence descended heavy and expectant. Some whispered in disbelief, others shrugged, convinced the Reich already ruled the skies. But Canaris knew differently. He understood, as few did, that in modern warfare, triumph belongs not to the most fervent, but to the most efficient. And somewhere in Michigan, efficiency itself had become a weapon. Outside the bustling streets of Berlin, the newspapers celebrated victories in Russia. Factories churned out Panzer IVs, and the Führer promised a 1,000-year Reich. Yet within the smoke-shrouded corridors of intelligence, a single man stared into the future and saw its fate sketched in blueprints in steel. Canaris survived the labyrinthine politics of the Reich, not by trusting appearances, but by trusting information. While others exulted in the glories of conquest, he spent his days sifting through intercepted dispatches, industrial surveys, and trade reports, quietly calculating the true power of a nation untouched by war's devastation, blessed with boundless resources, and forging marvels beyond imagination. His spies, scattered across neutral Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain, relayed details with hushed precision. A Swedish engineer described an aircraft assembly plant with the precision of an automobile line. A diplomat in Lisbon mentioned a conveyor belt longer than a battleship. Every encoded message, every meticulous observation, pointed to a single location, Willow Run, Michigan. At first, the notion seemed impossible. Ford Motor Company, the builder of Model Ts, now producing heavy bombers, each requiring over 1 million. Individual components from spark plugs to hydraulic systems, from oxygen masks to Norden bomb racks. How could such a machine emerge with the rhythm of a car rolling off an assembly line? And yet it did, with breathtaking ingenuity. Instead of building each bomber whole, Ford divided the task into thousands of repeatable, precise actions, each assigned to a worker trained for that single task. It was industrial elegance distilled to its purest form, repetitive, precise, monumental in scale. To the Allies, it was craftsmanship. To Canaris, it was a harbinger of destruction. He dispatched his findings to Berlin, marking them urgent. If Willow Run reached full capacity, it could eclipse the Luftwaffe's supremacy within a year, and yet, even as he wrote, he knew the peril his own words carried. In a regime that worshipped ideology, logic was heresy. In a system built on deceit, truth was treason. When the report reached the upper echelons, it was met with ridicule. Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, waved it away with theatrical disdain. "The Americans," he mocked, lips curling with scorn. "They make refrigerators and razors, not bombers." His aides cheered in agreement, and the matter was dismissed before the ink could dry. Yet behind the laughter lingered a quiet terror, the fear of admitting that an enemy had mastered that which Germany once prided itself upon, sheer industrial efficiency. The Reich still believed war was a matter of will, of blood, of destiny. Factories, labor, logistics, these were trivialities compared to ideology. They believed the spirit of a German soldier could overcome any shortfall in production. Even Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, would later admit that the figures stunned him. If only half of it were true, he wrote after the war, Germany had already lost the moment the first Willow Run bomber rolled off the line. Yet no one dared voice this truth to Hitler. Doubt was failure incarnate. Canaris, in his quiet office, continued to trace numbers and projections, the flickering lamplight dancing across his face. He could almost hear the faint hum of the American assembly line across the Atlantic, a rhythm of inevitability echoing like distant artillery, marking the rise of a new kind of battlefield, where steel, precision, and human ingenuity would determine the fates of millions. And outside the office, the world moved unaware, caught in the cadence of a war being reshaped by unseen hands, the echo of 1,000 engines waiting to roar. The notion that America could surpass Germany was once dismissed as sheer fantasy, a delusion too audacious to merit serious consideration. Consequently, Canaris's report was buried deep within the archives, and his name quietly slipped onto the ever-growing roster of those to be watched, a silent mark of suspicion. Meanwhile, in the smoke-filled cafes of Berlin, officers raised their glasses, toasting victories that no longer existed. Propaganda. Reels flickered across the walls, projecting triumphant convoys, gleaming new tanks, and grinning Luftwaffe pilots, their faces lit with false confidence. Yet, far from the public eye, in the shadowed rooms behind the Abwehr, analysts continued their meticulous calculations. Numbers did not lie, and they did not change. The war was shifting subtly, imperceptibly, from courage to capability, and capability was precisely where the Reich could no longer compete. Across the Atlantic, on the flat, expansive fields of Michigan, the impossible was taking shape. The Willow Run bomber plant, designed by architect Albert Kahn and financed by Henry Ford, had become the largest production facility the world had ever seen. Spanning more than 67 acres under one vast roof, the factory stretched so wide that workers joked about needing bicycles just to traverse it. To avoid taxation in 2 separate counties, the assembly line bent at a precise 90-degree angle mid-process, a literal tax curve that had become an engineering marvel. Here, Ford's philosophy of the assembly line had been reborn, magnified, and perfected. Each B-24 Liberator moved along a series of orchestrated stages, wings meeting fuselage in mechanical harmony, engines lowered into place by cranes in ceaseless motion, every rivet and panel falling into synchronized rhythm. By mid-1944, the workforce had grown to 42,000, a third of them women, real-life Rosies the Riveter. Thousands more were African Americans, many relocating north for the first time to contribute to the war effort. Farmers, teachers, and homemakers labored side by side, around the clock, 7 days a week. The air inside Willow Run was dense with the smell of oil, metal, and ozone. The relentless heartbeat of industry pounded day and night, and every 63 minutes, another bomber rolled from the hangars under its own power, poised for takeoff. In comparison, German aircraft factories required weeks to complete a single plane. Ford called this mass production the freedom of efficiency. The Allies called it the arsenal of democracy. For Canaris, it was a nightmare realized. Each new bomber represented a city now within reach, each shift at the plant a step toward Germany's undoing. Within a single year, Willow Run produced more aircraft than the Luftwaffe could possibly replace, and the Reich was powerless to stop it. By 1944, the skies over Europe had changed color. They no longer belonged to German pilots. They belonged to the endless formations of four-engine bombers launching from England and Italy. Their engines sang the inevitable. The February 1944 Big Week campaign proved it. Over 6 days, thousands of Willow Run bombers pounded the heart of Germany's industrial centers. Factories in Regensburg, Leipzig, and Gotha vanished beneath clouds of fire. Aircraft assembly lines were obliterated, and synthetic fuel plants smoldered for months. German losses were staggering. Hundreds of planes and pilots, irreplaceable, were lost in just 1 week. Panic rippled through the corridors of power in Berlin. Hitler demanded new wonder weapons, jets, rockets, miraculous devices capable of turning the tide. But miracles required materials, both of which were in short supply. Canaris, increasingly isolated and alienated, knew the truth. It was over. He had warned them when action was still possible. Now it was too late. The Reich was undone not by superior armies or strategy, but by arithmetic, by production capacity, outmatching the illusions of a nation once proud of its power. When Germany finally looked up, the skies were filled with machines that hubris had deemed impossible. Beneath them, the very factories that had mocked the weak American industrial machine now lay silent, buried beneath the rubble of their own skepticism. Admiral Canaris would not live to see the peace that followed. After the failed July 20th plot against Hitler, the Gestapo seized his diaries, evidence of his resistance. He was arrested, tried in secret, and executed at Flossenburg concentration camp in April 1945, strangled with a piano wire as Allied forces advanced. Weeks later, Germany surrendered. A war that began with ideology ended with mathematics. The Allies had produced 300,000 aircraft. Germany had barely managed a third of that. Willow Run alone churned out nearly 7,000 liberators, exceeding the entire operational bomber fleet of the Luftwaffe that year. After the war, Willow Run returned to automobile production, its assembly lines humming with the rhythm of peace once more. Today, it stands as a monument to industrial scale, efficiency, and determination, but its deeper legacy runs far beyond metal and machines. It proved that the chaos of liberty could outmatch the order of tyranny. That diversity, once scorned as weakness, could become an ultimate strength. History remembers Canaris as the spy who foresaw the truth too early, and Willow Run as the factory that ended the war before generals could even recognize it. Because in the end, it was not bombs or bullets that destroyed the Reich. It was disbelief in reality itself. And reality, unlike empires, never dies.